Hello, and welcome to the Imposter Syndrome Network podcast, where everyone belongs, especially if you think you don't. My name is Chris Grundeman, and this is the Steve Dodd episode. Steve was a terror since the modem pool era. He's been a network engineer for at least 20 years, working on some brand name networks such as Salesforce, Facebook, and Slack. He's smart, humble, hardworking, and collaborative, as long as you don't call him on a powder day. Hey, Steve, would you like to introduce yourself a bit further to the Imposter Syndrome Network?
Yeah, sure. So, that was a great intro. Yeah, I kind of stumbled into networking as a career and, definitely grew and gradually worked on larger and larger networks throughout the course of my career. And now, I'm currently at Slack working on, not even my own network. It's all abstracted away and basically AWS cloud. So it's been quite the journey.
Fantastic. Let's dive into it. I'm going to start maybe in an odd place, but we, I believe, share a passion for the mountains and for snow. Although I do think that you unfortunately have failed to evolve from skiing to snowboarding, but we'll let that go. Do you see any parallels between skiing and networking? Or maybe a better way to ask that is, have you learned anything from skiing that you apply in your career?
For sure. I think consistency in practice is like something that translates quite well. It's funny. I think there are definitely like prodigies out there, both in the networking world and in the, skiing or, whatever athletic or technical endeavor it might be. But I think sitting down and kind of having some introspection and looking, kind of reviewing your performance is definitely worthwhile and has behooved me in my career. And I think it's just definitely of benefit to kind of, just look at how you're doing, look at what you could do better. And maybe also like, I think this translates well to kind of the concept of coaching or like external feedback. And like, if someone sees something and says, hey, you could make that turn a little more crisp by getting more on your edge, or like, hey, this design has a particular shortcoming in this edge case. Have you considered this? Just being open to that feedback and being receptive. I think that's an important, like, not just a skill, but like an important way to like operate. And if you don't do that, you just kind of get really myopic and maybe, miss something really important in whatever activity it is that you're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that completely. Following on to that, I mean, has that something that's been a big part of your career? Have you had any or many mentors who have really influenced your journey so far?
I've definitely had mentors. It's funny. A lot of the people that I would consider kind of like formative in my career, I actually haven't met, but it was more their writing style or documentation style or presentation style that I take from. So VJ Gill comes to mind. Like he did a Anon presentation on, I think it was AOL's migration from OSPF to ISIS.
I remember that presentation. Yeah.
Yeah. And, it was funny and it was technical and it was really well done. And I actually, basically ended up doing a very similar migration at one of the places that I worked early in my career. And it really gave me the confidence to kind of outline the plan. And, as a junior engineer, I think taking something kind of that foundational to the network and like, potentially impactful to the business, that's kind of a scary thing to do. So it was really cool to kind of have that path be documented and have something kind of, just available to follow as a blueprint. Not necessarily network related, but like Joel Spolsky and like the Joel on Software blog, like really early on while I was still in school even, I used to read that blog a lot, and like just the kind of insights into productivity and what it took to kind of like do your best work as in the software field, I found like super fascinating. And I think a lot of those insights or spicy takes have like still aged fairly well and are like still very like applicable in the workplace today.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it definitely is. I mean, I was going to say it's a sign of the times, but I guess this is something that's gone on for a long time, right? I mean, I guess there's been people wrote down things and put, whether it was letters or books or newspapers or, there's been a way to kind of absorb knowledge and experience from other humans for quite a while. But the level that we can do it now is pretty amazing, right? As you said, like this idea of, blogs and recorded talks and this kind of stuff where you don't ever have to meet somebody and you can really share their experience in a lot of different ways. Seems fairly unique to our time of existence.
Yeah, totally. It's a very passive form of mentorship, but I think there's a lot of people that have had outsized impact on the networking world. I think I'm going to butcher his name, but Ivan Pepniak,
I think you nailed it. Actually, I don't know for sure.
But. Sweet, prolific blogger. Shared a bunch of insights, wrote tons of books, and just that impact and being available, and but more importantly, just kind of the sharing of that knowledge, and at least passing it down and not having it be totally tribal. I think it's gone a long way. Yeah, and he's a great example of that. There's tons of other people. I'm sure I couldn't enumerate them all, but he's a great example of someone willing to share very deep knowledge in the networking field. Yeah,
which is interesting. I mean, that's kind of a totally different skill set, right? The communication side of it, to being able to package it up and kind of give it to other folks is quite a bit different than just doing it yourself.
Yeah, 100%. Being able to articulate that concept in a relatable way, and take something that's hyper technical and kind of distill it down to explain it like I'm five, and just make it consumable for something that is hyper technical. I think that's a real skill not a lot of people excel at. So it's really neat to see that actually get exercised.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of highly technical, right now you're a staff engineer at Slack. What does that mean? What does your day-to-day kind of look like? What is a staff engineer at Slack? You mentioned the fact that kind of the network you work on has become much more ephemeral or not owned, which I think is a really interesting trend. Also, right, this idea that we in large part used to, or in some cases, work on kind of physical infrastructure that's racked and cabled up and stuff. But now a lot of networking, you don't own the infrastructure at all, and you've still got to make the packets flow reliably and predictably. So that's interesting. But going back to the original question, maybe what's the day-to-day look like? What are you actually doing there?
Yeah, Sandra. So I'm on a team called Demand Engineering. We're basically responsible for the ingress traffic side of Slack. So you're running a Slack client, on your computer or on your phone. You want to send a message. How does that traffic get back to Slack's infrastructure for processing? And let's say that you did an app channel or something, so it's an announcement. How do we, in a timely manner, get that notification pushed out to everybody else, in that channel or in that workspace? So there's the ingress piece that kind of gets the traffic from a client to the Slack infrastructure itself, and then within Slack's infrastructure, we run a service mesh that there's a whole bunch of different microservices or Kubernetes or EC2 based services that, like you said, they're ephemeral. They come and go because it's running on someone else's computer. How do we keep track of those endpoints and make sure that traffic's able to flow between those services in a consistent manner? So that boils down to, our technology stack isn't particularly, I wouldn't say it's super unique. We use Console for service discovery. We use Envoy for service mesh. There's a little bit of magic glue for the actual service mesh library for a thing called Rotor that was an acquihire. And then, the rest is just DNS, which will fail you in all sorts of interesting and unique ways.
Yes, indeed, it will. And then I see that you also, at least, and I don't know how full-time this is. I mean, different people do different things here. I see you've got kind of a company or project called Idahood where you do some consulting work that's been going on for the past decade or so. Is that something that you actively work on, or is it kind of just between jobs, or how does that work for you?
It's kind of like pick and take. A lot of the time, I have a pretty good relationship with some of my former employers going way, way back. And a lot of them are very tiny rural telecom companies. So they don't necessarily have the particular expertise that's super deep on an MPLS implementation on a brownfield network, or the BGP policy framework and how to structure that to get their best bang for their buck for their transit and their peering. And so a lot of times it'll be kind of these just real point engagements where, there's a specific project and kind of a pretty tight scope of work. And it's hey, can you help us out with this thing? And so I've done that over the years quite a bit. I think if I could do that full time, that would be the most rewarding for me. I think building, infrastructure for real people in rural communities and for me, having DSL or broadband just available in general, as a teenager, really kind of shaped my path within the industry and kind of like really set me up for a great career and great life in general. And so being able to like pay that back or pay it forward is a really neat experience. So just any way that I can kind of like help enable some of those rural broadband initiatives, I find like super rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. I can totally see that. It's definitely something that's where I kind of started too, was rural broadband and kind of building networks out in the woods and the mountains and stuff in Colorado in my case. And definitely still has a very strong piece of my heart in that.
Yeah, I totally get that. Like, it's very similar. Like Idaho and Montana, like those were kind of where I cut my teeth and like got to do a lot of. I like to use the term cowboy engineering, but it's kind of like you just, there's not a lot of established process. You're doing a thing, you like, got to make it work. You have the 4-hour maintenance window or whatever, and you got to cobble something working back together by the end of that time frame. And I think it's definitely exciting and unstructured in some ways. I think it can. If you do it forever, you can get really burned out doing that too. The lack of structures eventually catches up too. So there's, different facets kind of depending on your age and stage in life too, I think.
Fair, for sure. I think that's definitely true. So is that how you got started in tech? I mean, like, where was that? Maybe you can talk a little bit about your progression into kind of networking. I mean, did you go and work for a rural telecom right away, or was there kind of stepping stones to get there, or how did that all start for you?
No, so I was a student helper for the network team at University of Idaho, Go Vandals. And so basically that was like replacing failed equipment and wiring closets or like doing upgrades. And then I started that the summer of my senior year, basically. And then a few months into that, one of the guys I was like in a little closet that sat underneath the stairwell, and that was like my office. The guy came and knocked on my door. He's like, we have a full-time position open. It's been open for a while. It's like, oh, that's cool. And he's like, well, if you were to get a full-time position, half-time school is basically paid for and you could just finish. Oh, okay. I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
So I applied and eventually got the position. But I like totally fell into networking as a career. I had done like a CCNA type program in high school, but I had never really done much with that. I'd done like help desk at a local ISP back in the day. But then I was a math student. So I really had no plan once I was graduating. It was either kind of go to graduate school or figure something else out. And, opportunity presented itself. And then, worked for the university for about 3 years. And then that was right around the time where like the NANOG mailing list was still kind of like in its prime and kind of the place to be. So I was reading about all these service provider technologies. And then a local service provider called Syringa Networks in Idaho had a position come up, and that's where I transitioned over to the service provider world. And that was right when kind of the transition for cell carriers from 3G to 4G was happening. So everybody was throwing fiber in the ground. Everybody was doing Ethernet over, some sort of tunnel, be it Ethernet over Ethernet or Ethernet over MPLS. So I got to build out basically a decent sized MPLS network supporting a bunch of wireless carriers and kind of other tertiary use cases. But and that's where I think where I really saw that like building something for your local community was super cool.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very cool. And it's interesting, one of the things that struck me there, maybe the least relevant to you, but one that's interesting to me is, that idea of that NANOG mailing list in its prime. And this is something that I think about quite a bit, especially talking to other folks that are, somewhere near my age, right? Plus or minus 10 years, just how we've lived through this kind of change in communications technology that you and I just talked about a little bit before. But I think one of the reasons that the NANOG mailing list was so amazing at that time, and not that it's kind of gone away here now, it's that there's so many other avenues and options and things now, right? So, when I don't know about you, but when I first started reading the NANOG mailing list, like there wasn't a YouTube to go look for networking videos on YouTube. There was no TikTok, there was no Twitter, right? I mean, so this NANOG mailing list was that was where you talked about, maybe before that IRC and like the Pound IX channels and some of that stuff, but like the NANOG mailing list really was the only place to go talk about service provider networking for quite a while.
Yeah, it was definitely like a very hyper focused, like gathering point, and I think there was some, like you mentioned, even fewer blogs, or just I'm trying to think at the time there were maybe some people's like Blogspot, like my CCIGE journey type blogs, but that was about it. Yeah. And then otherwise, it was just very condensed and not diluted. And so you kind of, if you wanted to absorb some knowledge, you ended up getting redirected to the Piper Mail archive one way or the other. And then it was like, oh, I might as well just subscribe, right? And, there was a lot of not necessarily like maybe not applicable to your problem, but just a lot of adjacent networking problems. And again, so I think it was, for me, like really piqued my interest because I was not in the service provider world. And I was like, oh, all these tunnels that people keep talking about, like that's interesting. Like what's going on here? Yeah.
Which is reminiscent of kind of the early internet in a lot of ways, just this idea that like, I don't know that anybody surfs the web the way that we used to in the early days now, like where you're going to, because there was no search engines, right? So you're just kind of following hyperlinks around and stumbling into stuff and finding like weird, interesting things. And anyway, I see some corollaries there in the kind of banana list where you'd see some topic pop up and you're like, oh, that's really interesting, and learn all about this thing that had nothing to do with your job, but was really interesting.
Yeah, I think the closest thing, like maybe in modern parlance, is like the Wikipedia rabbit hole, right? Where you just like keep clicking down a thing, and you're way off the initial subject that you started looking at, but you get sucked into something. But yeah, I feel like information is a lot more available nowadays, so it's much easier to have kind of the maybe like, I don't know, less respondent. It's just more instant reward or instant gratification of like, I'm trying to do a thing. And even maybe like more so now with like ChatGPT or something, you like type in your question and you get an answer. Whether or not it's a convincing lie or not is an exercise kind of left to the reader. But it's just a lot more immediate in kind of that getting that information provided.
Yeah, now you just have to fight off all the ads instead of trying to dig for the information.
Totally.
And the reason we can even have this conversation is because we are kind of a similar age. You've been doing this for 20 something years now. With the career you've had, I think, you've had some really good, some great projects, some really cool achievements. And, at this point, 20 years in, you're a staff engineer. And so I'm sure there would have been some opportunities maybe to move into management or kind of take that different track. And I'm interested in kind of what it is you like about being an individual contributor and why you've kind of stuck to more of the kind of pure engineering versus going off on a path. Other folks have ended up maybe in marketing or even in sales or, like I said, management's a clear path after that long of a career. Not everyone sticks with kind of more pure engineering.
Totally. I think it's interesting. I did an engineering management program, like master's thing at University of Colorado, thinking that I was going to maybe transition to management at one point. And I think what I found is there's just really different skill sets. Like I'm good at the engineering side. I'm not great with like managing people or careers. I'm a little selfish, honestly, when it comes to like my time and my interests. And so I'm still, I think the technical side, I'm still really interested in the technical work that I'm doing. And then outside of it, like outside of work, like I really just want to put it down and go skiing or go climbing or go like hang out with my family. I'm very compartmentalized in that regard. And it's not that I like don't care about my coworkers. Like I think they're great and fantastic people. It's just, I think ultimately I have enough trouble managing my own career that it's
you need to be responsible for them, right? You can care for them without being responsible.
Yeah. That like that responsibility externally, like I'm a dog guy and that's about it.
That makes total sense. Yeah. I like it. Looking back, what role would you say you learned the most in? Is there one job or one role or one project where you kind of really accelerated your learning and came away, maybe changed even?
Yeah, so I think I talked about the Syringa Networks role. So that was the career place where I did the IGP migration from to ISIS and rolled out in an MPLS network, and really just like. That company was on a rocket ship trajectory as far as growth goes. So it was like you're always deploying something new, always like adapting to a new customer requirement or deploying a new technology or trying to, basically respond to whatever the sales guys had sold. We had to go do that thing like right away. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way at all. Like they were good at that. So we were like always augmenting. And I think it was really good for me to see kind of the intersection of the technical and the business side in that regard, and just see how to drive, actual revenue growth with the portfolio of the products that we'd offer, and like understand the operational impact of, okay, if we're going to offer this new thing, we have to be able to support it. What does that look like? What processes do we need? What training do we need? It's not just create a config template and you're done. right? Like that's not a sustainable way to operate, or you can do that until the first outage and then the business dies. So like really getting close enough to the business to understand where the paycheck was coming from, I think was really beneficial for me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, I think that is a leap forward in a lot of people's careers, right? When you kind of tie, because there's this kind of, I don't know, historical animosity between sales and engineering teams. It feels like, at least I was kind of raised, quote unquote, raised that way through the first parts of my career, and then eventually kind of figure out, okay, well, I don't get paid if they don't do their job, which is interesting. But then also to your point, right? I think I was the same way, right? Like working at a value-added reseller, systems integrator, and handling customer work that was just flying at you from all different directions is definitely a place where I learned a ton, right? You get exposed to so many different environments so fast, and you're kind of solving these different challenges. Is really, really interesting. Yeah, I like that a lot. In there, you mentioned kind of, planning that lasts maybe until the first outage. Is there a time in your career where you've completely failed?
Oh, yeah. I fail a lot. I think, it's funny, but so we talked about skiing and how that translates a little bit. So I think rock climbing for me translates even more. So I'm into sport climbing, which is with a rope, and you go up and you like try to climb a route, and then you'll fall off because you can't do the move, and you have to like rehearse the move and try and figure out a sequence to get you, past that high point till you get to the finish. And on a really hard climb, that can take you dozens, if not like 100 tries if you're trying something like really hard at your limit. So like failure for me is not like a bad thing. It's always a learning opportunity. But I think failing and being able to mitigate risk is like the more important thing. So I've had definitely like some bad outages in my career, but I think the quick lesson that I like really internalized from those outages was like, it's important to have a backup plan or a saving throw of some kind, whether that's console access or, somebody on site to go, reset a node back to a known good state that you can access, or like all these different risk mitigation techniques. And so that's definitely something that was like a harsh lesson early on. My funniest like outage story that I think I can share, I think, is
we'll protect the name to the extent.
Yeah. Just I won't mention which state it was, but we were rolling out. We had this management network, and it used VPLS. And I guess for those that don't know, VPLS is it's a layer 2 overlay technique using MPLS, but it requires a full mesh normally amongst all the nodes, and that's to basically to emulate like an Ethernet segment and avoid loops. So you avoid loops by you receive a frame and you send it out everywhere else. But if you want to scale that, you break that full mesh and you do what's called hierarchical VPLS, and all of a sudden you deliberately introduce the potential for loops. Or in my case, I actually introduced the loop, and I took down this management network for an entire state. And fortunately, we tacked down a CO tech who could, go out there and unplug the box and like get us back. But that was, kind of a harrowing 40 minutes of trying to get a hold of somebody. Fortunately, it was just the management side, right? Not actually customer impacting, but definitely an exciting afternoon.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an understatement. Well, unfortunately, although there's much more I'd like to cover and talk to you about, we didn't even get to the, a lot of things I wanted to ask you, but we're about out of time for today. Steve, do you have any projects or causes or anything you'd like to highlight for the Imposter Syndrome Network? Maybe something we've talked about or something we haven't?
One of the things that I've gotten more into, I just talked about how I am not super into necessarily the like management side. But I think the mentorship side that we talked about, like that's becoming more and more important to me as I like get further into this stage of my career. So I really encourage people to like mentor junior people on your team, and not just on like the technical stuff, but on like life stuff. I've had really interesting conversations about just compensation and like, did you know that we have a 401k match? Like you should take advantage of that. Like that's free money. And some of these like kind of things that might seem very obvious if you're a little further into your career, but and can make it like a very positive difference if you're early in your career, and you like start some of these compounding effects. Yeah, it's really interesting to me to just talk about some of generational wealth shifts that have happened with the tech industry specifically, because I think the opportunity is there if you're willing to work really hard. And so I think it's just really kind of the American dream, if you will, at the moment, at least, or it was our latest gold rush, right? And I don't know what the new one is, but
yeah, right, yeah. That's a very good question. I'd love to be able to put my finger on it. Some people say AI. Others are waiting for medical advances to kind of be the next thing. I mean, who knows, right? It's also, but it definitely has been computers and networking up to this point, and I think for a while longer. We've got some road left to do some good work.
And I don't think the run's over. I think just the word's out, right? So there are more people trying to do it. Yeah,
that makes total sense. Well, Steve, thank you so much for sharing your story with the Imposter Syndrome Network, and thank you to all of our listeners for your time, your attention, and your support. If you found this episode insightful or interesting, please consider paying it forward by letting others know about this show and the great guests we have on. But I do have one more question for you, Steve. I'd love to understand, or I'd love to know what you think the kind of most valuable lesson you've learned in your career so far is, if you can put a pin on it.
Most valuable lesson. I think for me, like, be able to defend a decision with data, but recognize that people might have an emotional response to whatever thing you're recommending, and like try to be empathetic and understand what that, like, where they're coming from with their response, because humans aren't rational ultimately. And so I think there's, you can be right and not get your way a lot of the time. So I think being able to navigate that space is a real skill that'll help you in your career.
I think that's a huge one, especially for those of us who work in technology, where a lot of us, maybe working with humans isn't always the easiest thing, right? Working with machines has been a little bit easier, which may be why we fell into networking or storage or computer, whatever it is we work on kind of in the digital infrastructure space. I really like that, right? Being able to have the data to back it up, but understand that emotions are going to be at play, probably. Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
I like it. Well, hey, thanks again. And we will be back next week. I don't know if you've watched the show before or anything, or how much. I forget if we talked about it very much at all.
Yeah, I mean, I watched a couple episodes. I'm trying to remember. There were some heavy hitters. There's like Vince Cerf, I feel like, was one. Yeah. So, Imposter Syndrome. There you go.
Yeah.